Welcome. I'm thrilled by the event that we have prepared for you for today, which will soon be introduced by one of the Moynihan public scholars who is behind the organization of this, Jonathan Derbyshire. So my role here is to say welcome to all of you here, those of you who know the Moynihan Center already, and those of you who don't. We are a center at the City College of New York that does several things: undergraduate fellowships that direct and encourage and support promising students from City College who want to go into public service. And we have, tied to that, a senior fellows program where we bring in academics, journalists, and professionals of public service that conduct research and engage in mentorship and pedagogical activities with our students for a period of 1 year. And it is out of that senior fellowship program. We have two of our senior fellows here today that will soon be introduced. So I'm really excited about these conversations, which couldn't be more topical. And I have agreed with the speakers and the organizers that they will all engage with each other, but in the spirit of what we do, this is all for our students, so there will be ample time for questions from the audience at the end. I encourage you all to start thinking about them and preparing them as the speakers engage. And without further ado, I give the word to Jonathan, who will be moderating the event. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Carlo, and thank you to Michael Miller as well and the Moynihan Center for giving me the opportunity to moderate this discussion with such a distinguished panel. And it's great to see so many of you here. Let me briefly introduce them. On my right is Naomi Schaefer Riley, who, like me, is also a Moynihan Center public scholar. She's senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she works on issues relating to child welfare, and she's also a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. She's the author of several books, including No Way to Treat a Child and Be the Parent, Please. On my left, Sohrab Ahmari is US editor of Unheard and a founding editor of Compact magazine, a publication I'm sure some of you will know, which is devoted, I think, Sohrab, to the promotion of a politics of the common good. His books include Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It, and the forthcoming The Triumph of Normal, which he has described, and I'm quoting you, Sohrab, as a counsel of calm to conservatives worried it's all going to hell. And finally, Matthew Sitman, who is the co-presenter of the excellent Know Your Enemy podcast he co-hosts with Sam Adler-Bell, which is devoted to critically examining the personalities of the American right. He's also a regular contributor to Dissent magazine, which is one of the sponsors of the podcast, and formerly was an associate editor at Commonweal, a magazine edited by lay Catholics covering religion, politics, and culture. And in fact, Matt, Catholicism is something you have in common with Sohrab. Naomi, I don't know what your denominational affiliation is. Jewish. Thank you. So I'm going to ask each of you to make some very brief introductory remarks, and then I'll engage these other speakers in conversation before opening the discussion to the floor. As Carlo said, we're very keen to hear from you in due course. But before I do that, let me just make a couple of very brief remarks of my own before handing over to the panel. I'm hoping this conversation is going to help us to at least get some of the way to answering two questions. First, how did conservatives, broadly construed, and I suspect there'll be some discussion in what follows of who exactly the principled conservatives in the title of this discussion are exactly, how did conservatives come to see Donald Trump, a man with no background in the conservative movement prior to his entry into national politics, how did they come to see Trump as a plausible vehicle for their ambitions? Now, it strikes me that one of the earliest and still most persuasive versions of this conservative argument for Trump was Michael Anton's 2016 essay, which many of you will know, The Flight 93 Election, which appeared in the House magazine of the conservative think tank, the Claremont Institute. And I suspect that argument, or a version of it, will come up for discussion in what follows. And the second question concerns the marriage of convenience, if that's what it is, between conservatives and Trump. Is that relationship now beginning to unravel? Thanks, as Carlo was alluding to, in part because of the president's apparently newfound taste for the kind of foreign entanglements he'd previously disavowed, but also, and I think just as importantly, because of the tolerance inside the MAGA movement for unapologetic Groper-style racism and anti-Semitism. So I'm going to ask Naomi to kick us off with a few brief opening remarks. Naomi.
Sure. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Moynihan Center for hosting this panel. So I want to sort of start. I'm a journalist by training. I worked at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Commentary, National Review, a bunch of different conservative publications. But I wanted to start off by kind of describing my journey to trying to understand why conservatives, but why anyone like Trump. So I want to start off, so it's 2016, it's election day. In the weeks prior to this, my daughter's nursery school class had been learning about elections. And so they decided to have a fake election where they were going to figure out whether the class preferred as a pet a dog or a fish. And so every day she came home and sort of gave us the update. Someone had brought in a dog, they had asked questions about owning a dog, someone had brought in a fish, similar sort of situation. But we all kind of laughed and thought, well, this is ridiculous. Like, who would ever, especially if you're a 4-year-old, prefer a fish to a dog? We kind of thought the election was rigged. So I went to pick her up. It's about 2:30 on election day. And she gets into the car and she says, "Mom, you'll never guess what happened." I said, "What?" She said, "The fish won." And I all of a sudden had this feeling like, really? And she said, "I know. No one I know voted for the fish." I swear this is a true story. But I went to my election night party then, and I, along with I think a lot of other people in New York City, was just as shocked to find out the results of our national election as I was to find out the result of the preschool election. I will say I wasn't as shocked. I did not feel like I was as much in a bubble as many of my friends and neighbors in New York. I had spent a lot of time traveling to a lot of different parts of the country in what we used to call Red America. I spent a lot of time writing about religion. I visited a lot of evangelical colleges. I spent time at Brigham Young. I spent a lot of time in the South. And so I didn't think I was quite as sheltered as maybe other people were when it came to this. But it turns out I was also sort of looking at a very interesting slice of the population. And even though that it was Red America, it was a very educated slice of Red America. And so I had completely missed what I think at the time was really a story about the economy. I think we all sort of missed Bill Clinton's famous advice about how it's the economy stupid. And there were a lot of people who were hit very hard by the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And I think we saw a lot of the effects of that in the first election of Donald Trump. I think wages had not gone up and people were sort of really upset with kind of how the establishment was running the economy and their experience in it. So fast forward, I think that was sort of the first kind of, and I would say that those people were not necessarily conservatives. Millions of those people, by the way, had voted for Obama in the previous election. I think they were probably independents. There were some conservatives among them who were kind of willing to overlook a lot of Trump's deficiencies in order to, because that's what their wallets were telling them to do. And then I think, you have this sort of, fast forward to, Trump's second election. And I think, he appealed to sort of a different set of people. As many people have pointed out, Trump has been very lucky in his enemies. And I think at that point, you had a different cohort of people. There was some overlap of people who were really, really annoyed with sort of the way the country had been run for the previous 4 years. But particularly, they were not happy with the state of the culture. They were not happy happy with DEI. They were not happy with the sort of racial reckonings. They were not happy with the transgender stuff. And so I think, he, in that sense, again, it was more of a sense of what people were rejecting by voting for Trump than necessarily what they were embracing. Just to sort of sum up my initial remarks, I would say I consider myself a principled conservative. I am not a fan of Donald Trump at all. I'm a free market, pro-foreign intervention, daughter of Straussians, neoconservative, free trade, anti-tariff, pro-life conservative. And I'm not a fan of Trump. So I'm not entirely sure who on the panel is going to be defending the idea that principled conservatives have embraced Trump, but I'm not that person. So over to you.
Thank you, Naomi. Sohrab.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for convening this, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Moynihan Center for hosting us, and I think, of course, to the namesake of the center, and I think this is, I have no idea where he would fall on the debate that's at issue, but I think he would certainly appreciate the debates, which is all that the center should be expected to do, is to foster that debate. So I will, similarly to Naomi, and both of us are veterans of the Wall Street Journal editor, in my case, a kind of exile of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. So we share a kind of background there. I will similarly situate my observations in relation to my own journey, broadly speaking, on the right of center. And I guess I'd start by more pointedly questioning the framing of in the title of the event. About principled conservatives embracing Trump. At one level, I think there's some of that going on. That is, people who believed X, Y, Z, and then jettisoned those beliefs in order to, make peace with the person who had taken over the Republican Party, the major party of the right. That's certainly true, but I would sort of introduce another layer first, which is to say that the principles of the old Republican Party had failed. They were the pre-Trump Republican Party were pretty, I've written down rotten now. I think that's a bit of maybe too strong, but here we are. By this, I mean, of course, the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, has gone through multiple iterations since its founding in the Civil War. The Democrats, of course, being older, the party of Jackson and Van Buren is not today's Democratic Party, and there's been multiple shifts. So when I say the old kind of pre-Trump Republican Party, I don't mean to stretch back to the 19th century. I mean the post-Nixon consensus of the party, in which there was a, roughly speaking, it's often described as a three-legged stool, a sort of tripartite arrangement whereby economic policy was outsourced to pro-business libertarians, including, of course, the sort of premier outlet for that, which is the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and a host of other think tanks and so on. Foreign policy was left to the foreign policy hawks, of course, in the context of the Cold War. That meant something. There was this sort of bipolar opposition. And that helped organize the other three elements of the three-legged stool. It brought them together, and the third one, of course, being social or cultural policy, which was the domain of religious traditionalists, Catholics and evangelicals united with conservative Jews, forming, that's like the mid-century conservative triple social conservative core. And so when I started on the right, I more or less accepted this formation, this consensus. I felt I was an enthusiastic spokesperson for it, filing numerous of those like unsigned editorials. Much of it I was based in Europe, calling for Europe to up its defense spending and lower regulations, lower marginal tax rates, and so on, and introduce more in countries that had more, public social welfare elements to dismantle those and go for private management of those, so on. Then this shock came to my system, our system. I remember all my colleagues were at the time pretty alarmed, shocked, dismayed by the rise of Donald Trump. And you could take three paths from that. Well, first of all, why was it shocking? It was because he challenged almost every element of that consensus. On foreign policy, I remember there was a debate, a GOP primary debate in South Carolina, February 2016, where he said the Iraq War was a disaster. And Jeb Bush was right there, and he just became like flummoxed, and it was just one of those classic Trump moments. Now, to you, that might seem like a banal thing to say. Of course, the Iraq War was like this decade-long black hole of lives and treasure. But for me, as a sort of movement conservative writer at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, it was like a kind of gasping moment, but also in a way, a kind of permission structure to say something that a lot of us, especially younger conservatives, now I'm 41 years old, so don't make me think like I'm not young anymore, but at the time, kind of felt to be true. We knew it to be true, but it was kind of a taboo to say that the Iraq War had been a disaster. On social and economic policy, of course, he described the various free trade arrangements, especially NAFTA and China's entry into the World Trade Organization, as a disaster for working class Americans, as something that had decimated the heartland, destroyed jobs, took away good union jobs, which is why a lot of those people that Naomi described, double Obama voters, typically working class, turned to Trump in 2016, and then he expanded the coalition from there. And he would say things like, he hinted at support for a public option in healthcare. Again, in one of the debates, he would say, I'm not going to let people die on the streets. That kind of model of totally private healthcare in which, if you don't have insurance, you might confront a situation like that is unacceptable. And Ted Cruz said, and it was one of these 2016 debates, Ted Cruz said, so you're a socialist. And Trump just said, I'm not going to let people die on the streets. And notably, the audience roared at that response, like they cheered. Likewise, with the kind of classic New Deal and post-New Deal entitlement programs, I call them earned benefit programs, but we can get into why I insist on that language. But he was supportive of those, the sort of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. He would say, I'm not going to cut those. Again, a pledge that was renewed in the 2024 campaign as well. So for me, it was like, wait, why are the people who are technically our base as the right not following along with the program that we keep every day? We sort of dutifully repeat that, entitlements are a mistake, and we should be hawkish on foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. Like, they were rejecting this. Why is that? Now, there were, I would say, three paths out of that. When you're confronted with voters rejecting your basic worldview at every level, in a way, you can go in three directions. And I would say one is a kind of cynical accommodation. And I think that's the path of some people in the Republican Party being like, all right, they're going to go this way. Let's see what we can get out of him. Maybe we can get a tax cut. Who knows, we'll work with him. But, horrible. But, now we're suddenly starting to make Trump-friendly noises. A second path would be to go totally never Trump, and that became an entire movement of people who, depending on how never Trump they went, became outright Democrats. Someone like Bill Kristol today, complete rejection of the right. And then I would say there's the third path, and it's the one I took, which is a kind of a path of conversion, meaning to try to meaningfully think, okay, why was it that the older consensus had failed? I have to try to, it's a critique of me, and I'm going to try to meet it in some way, and try to even articulate as a theorist or as a thinker of the right, like how the right as an existing formation can rejigger its program to meet where these new impulses of the electorate are going. In my case, I did that for one of two reasons. Again, I felt like I had to respond if people aren't happy with the program we're putting forward. As a writer, I have to sort of try to understand that rather than just treat them as, rubes and morons and bigots. And second, for me, it was a kind of conversion to Catholicism which obviously, as you know, the Catholic faith does not treat the end of it doesn't frame the reason why we form political community to be we have to maximize our individual autonomy. Rather, the goal of political community is to secure the common good. So Catholicism also, for me personally, and for I would say a number of young, now middle-aged but then young conservatives, supplied a vocabulary and a conceptual framework for articulating a different kind of conservatism that would be, broadly speaking, pro-labor, or at least less lopsidedly pro-business in economic relations, so seeking tighter labor markets, partly through labor unions, and lots of people on the right embrace the idea of let's try to work at least with organized labor in the private economy. I would say I and Orrin Kask went furthest down that path. Oh, but there was also immigration restrictionism, now seen for some of us as a component of that. That is, that insofar as the U.S. had anything resembling Europe's model of social and Christian democracy, it was during the New Deal order, which happened to coincide with the tightest immigration regime this country has ever had, roughly from 1929 until the mid-60s, and to view relatively porous borders, which a lot of libertarian-type economic conservatives had supported as one mode of the kind of neoliberalism that had also manifested itself as in trade deals like NAFTA. Both of them involve essentially wage arbitrage, that is, playing populations and jurisdictions against each other to try to bring cheaper labor to bear, whether that means offshoring factories out there to places with brutal labor regimes, or bringing a working sort of underclass that can't vote, that doesn't speak the language, is hard to organize in a workplace, et cetera. So immigration restrictionism, a more robust cultural conservatism, which in retrospect I think is the most, to me now looking back, is the silliest aspect of trying to expect that from Trump. But we can get into that. That's the hairiest one for me. And the third one being a more restrained foreign policy. That is, we've gone abroad in search of monsters to destroy for too long, that we need domestic renewal, that at the very least we need to prioritize which regions really matter to US national security, and a lot of the people who came up in this ferment and tried to, again, rejigger what it meant to be on the right, called themselves not isolationists, but typically restrainers and prioritizers. And prioritizers, especially a lot of people in the current administration, sitting, I think, in a great deal of frustration. Their idea was, in a few years, the Pacific region will account for more than half of global GDP. So it's the area of greatest opportunity and challenge for the United States, and you have a near-peer rival power, China, there, that's determined to push the U.S. down the value chain, the industrial value chain. So if we're going to want to resist that, we're going to have to be a little bit more tight-fisted with where else we intervene. So, in that frame, Asia-Pacific takes the highest priority. Europe and the Middle East will kind of, that doesn't mean we completely disengage, but we'll come down the level of the area of importance. And also just if you've been at war for 2 decades after 9/11, the nation, it seems logically, needs a break to kind of focus on domestic reconsolidation. So I say all this, that this new consensus we tried to shape, and to be honest, I'm not sure that it ever really was anything more than partly GOP campaign time advertising in 2024 to a specific segment of the electorate, and partly just writers and intellectuals and party activists doing stuff that produced deliverables like magazine articles and think tank white papers, but didn't actually shape the Republican Party in a meaningful way. So I say all this as now, a decade later, I think that project has largely failed. Partly maybe that's colored by the new Iran war, which to me seems like the height of folly, and a sort of big return back to the old pre-Trump foreign policy consensus. Almost the rhetoric of liberating a people with bombs, et cetera, seems like 2003. It feels like I've taken a time machine back to 2003, and here we are. So I won't go further, but just to say, I'm not sure if that project of trying to create a new triple stool for the right really worked. And it's sad because I think it's going to mean a heavy electoral price to pay in 2026 and 2028. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Matt?
Well, thank you. Jonathan, you didn't mention that I'm actually furthest to your left, in this arrangement, which is fitting, I think.
Geographically and...
Yes,
Morally.
and I'm honored to be with all of you this afternoon, in part because we're here at City College, and your famous alcoves have featured prominently in various episodes of the podcast I co-host, Know Your Enemy. I'm going to keep my remarks short, but I hope they're at least a little bit provocative. The title of this panel, How Principled Conservatives Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love Trump, presupposes or at least suggests a distinction between principled conservatives and Trump and the MAGA movement. And therefore, I suppose that many, if not all, principled conservatives reluctantly have accommodated themselves with varying degrees of enthusiasm to Trump's ideological heterodoxies and, I might say, personal idiosyncrasies. And there's certainly a measure of truth to that. I'm actually glad I went after you, Sohrab. There's certainly a measure of truth to that, which can be seen, for example, in National Review's January 2016 Against Trump issue, which featured a roster of the conservative movement's luminaries pleading, basically, with Republican primary voters to not pick Trump. Now, whether or not Trump was aware of it or not, he was, as Sohrab detailed, running against the fusionist conservatism that wedded libertarian economics with aggressively confronting the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and perhaps slightly incongruously, traditional, often religiously inspired notions of virtue. That fusionism was first developed in the pages of National Review and became basically the operational philosophy of Reaganism and the GOP. There's a famous George Will quote, the Washington Post columnist, who wrote, "All great biblical stories begin with Genesis." He said this in 1980. And before there was Ronald Reagan, there was Barry Goldwater. And before there was Barry Goldwater, there was National Review. And before there was National Review, there was Bill Buckley with a spark in his mind. And the spark in 1980 became a conflagration. And I might add, along the way, Buckley stood against the cranks and the crackpots, the bigots on the fringes of the movement, whether from the John Birch Society to Joe Sobran. And again, at one level, I think this is true. I mean, who could be more different from the crude, cruel Trump than the urbane, sophisticated William F. Buckley Jr.? And for that matter, what could be further from the carnivalesque MAGA rallies than the seminars of bow-tie-wearing devotees of Russell Kirk? So there's a measure of truth in that distinction. However, the provocative note I want to hit is this. It's that perhaps one lesson of the Trump years is that purported principled conservatives had much less to learn in order to love Trump than the heroic narrative conservatives peddled about themselves would have led you to expect. So I just want to offer like an alternative perspective on this. Instead of describing the fusionism I mentioned and the kind of operational philosophy of Reaganism, what if you said, what if you framed it this way? A movement, the principled conservatism, that in many ways I think we definitely should consider someone like Buckley a founder of. National Review began that magazine in 1955. But the year before, he published a defense of McCarthyism with his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, and kind of guided by Buckley's teacher at Yale, Wilmore Kendall. So, a defense of McCarthyism. We know the Buckley family owned essentially a white citizens council newspaper in Camden, South Carolina. The Buckley threatened to punch a quote-unquote goddamn queer on national television. That he published an op-ed in the New York Times saying that HIV-positive men should have to receive a tattoo on their ass and on their forearms in case they're intravenous drug users. And National Review actually held a contest, an office contest for what the tattoo on the asses of HIV-positive gay men should be. And the winner was a quote from Dante, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." So, is it actually surprising that a movement founded in McCarthyism, resistance to desegregation, whose founder would say something like that about HIV-positive men? Is it actually shocking that it cashed out in something like Trump? I want to add one more detail. This is my favorite. Trump's kind of political mentor was Roy Cohn. And, when Cohn was basically kicked out of Washington, D.C., for his job on the, Senator McCarthy's staff, his work in that area, he was eventually, because he was gallivanting around Europe with a hot guy who, Roy Cohn was interested in, that came out. He eventually came back to Washington, D.C., moved from Washington, D.C. back to New York City. And there was a big party thrown at one of the big hotels in the city, and Bill Buckley was there, of course. But my favorite detail is that not long before his death, Roy Cohn, again, Trump's political mentor, was on trial to be disbarred for his various unethical activities. So he couldn't be a lawyer anymore. It was what this trial was about. And do you know who was a character witness at that trial? William F. Buckley Jr. So is it actually shocking that a movement, principled conservatism, that it cashed out in something like Trump? In some ways, it really is shocking. Trump really did run against the kind of old GOP orthodoxies and conservative movement orthodoxies. But there's other kind of matters, I think, that are relevant. And I just wanted to offer the perspective that perhaps if you kind of change the aperture slightly, is it actually all that shocking that principled conservatives have learned to love Trump? In many ways, I would say no. Even if there are many reasons it is surprising, there's also some that it's not.
Thank you so much, Matt, Sohrab, and Naomi. As I feared, each of the speakers has in different ways sought quite successfully, I think, to undermine the premise of the title I've given to this discussion. But we plough on.
It's a good try, Jonathan.
But we plough on regardless. Maybe picking up on some of the things Matt said there, we should reframe the question as how movement conservatism managed to accommodate itself to Trump. I just want to make one or two remarks about the Michael Anton piece that I mentioned in my opening remarks, because it does seem to me the locus classicus of the conservative case for a certain kind of conservative case for Trump. Sohrab, you've set out a rather different case, which we can come back to. I think there's a tension in that Anton piece, which is productive. We might want to explore it. He seems to make two arguments for Trump. The first is the argument from emergency. That's why he compares the 2016 election to the dilemma that confronted the passengers on Flight 93 on September the 11th, 2001. The emergency was so dire that the Conservatives had no choice but to throw their lot in with Trump. But there's a different argument Anton makes, which he says that Trump has the right position on the key issues, namely trade, immigration, and war. And I think we're going to come back to the question of the war, because that seems to me the issue that is causing this alliance between conservative intellectuals and the Trump administration to unravel in the ways that Sohrab has described. You struck a note of really quite striking disillusionment, Sohrab, at the end of your remarks. Is it over?
At this moment, I don't see a path to putting Humpty Dumpty together. I guess to use the Humpty Dumpty metaphor is to suggest that it's already kind of yeah, I do. I think that the Republican Party is basically irreformable in terms of as a potential vehicle for a more solidaristic and domestic policy and a more restrained foreign policy. I disagree. I mean, I don't deny any of the sort of the narrative that my friend Matt put forward. I think there's some continuity between the pre- and post-Trump Republican parties. However, I think the more powerfully explanatory elements, as I look to see, like, why is it that now we're facing a big Iran war, is just that the nature of the Republican Party is a party, in terms of its power base, has not changed even as it took on between 2016 and 2024 a whole set of new voters, including, again, as Naomi very aptly pointed out, the kind of twice Obama to twice Trump, or potentially 3 times Trump voters, which I know people in real world, people who voted twice for Barack Obama and then turned to Trump. But you bring on these voters, so working and lower middle class people, including, especially in 2024, increasingly people of color, nearly half of Hispanic men, a fifth of African American men. But you can't, like, turn it into a party that services those people's needs, because the power core of the party, I think, lies, one, is on foreign policy. Yes, it's partly the kind of pro-Israel community, which is powerful and had the president's ear in a way that all the restrainer and prioritizer types that he hired in the Pentagon, like, couldn't reach him, it seems to me. That's part of it, but there's also a lot of Southern power, as Michael Lind has pointed out, in terms of meaning a lot of senators from the South who have a particularly martial view of patriotism, as he argued recently in Unheard. That, so you think about all the people who defined Republican foreign policy on the Hill, a lot of them at least, the likes of Senator Cotton, Lindsey Graham, et cetera, come from that mindset. And then on domestic policy, it's not big business or the likes of a few billionaires like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, or now sort of Mark Zuckerberg, who sort of give the thrust of Republican domestic economic policy, who provide that direction. It's rather small and regional capital. I mean, I've argued this, but you can find all sorts of empirical studies suggesting it. It's showing it that the person who wields a great deal of power at the county or state level in the Republican Party is not the big business owner who has a large managerial corporation and is comfortable dealing with the regulatory state and the sort of labor unions and so on, but rather the person who owns a tire distribution network in a particular area in North Carolina. That's the kind of modal driver of Republican economic policy, and that person is like the least given to class compromise, the most suspicious of the administrative state, because margins are tighter, and so that's the kind of rubber chicken dinner figure who will year after year write checks and give toasts to the self-made man, and that has not changed under Trump. That's what I'm trying to get at. That has basically not changed under Trump, even though the voters had changed, and I think a lot of them are going to be lost now, but during this decade, that didn't change.
Naomi, I'd like to bring you in and ask you to respond maybe to that characterization of the current Republican Party, but also the bigger historical story Sohrab was telling in his opening remarks, because he was suggesting that the agenda that you declared your allegiance to, free market, small government, and so on.
Pro-immigration.
Pro-immigration. That Sohrab's contention was that the Trump agenda, which he saw as a source of great promise, was built on the ruins precisely of the agenda that you support. But maybe your side is scenting victory now, at least on the question of foreign intervention and the war with Iran.
So I guess I'd start by adding kind of a fourth option. Sohrab presented 3 potential responses to Trump on the right. And I think the one he missed is the one that I think I've tried to embrace, and a lot of the reasonable people I know have tried to embrace, which is calling balls and strikes. There are policies Trump, has put forward that I like, and policies that he's put forward that I do not like. And I, as an intellectual, as a journalist, I have not been afraid to say when I like them and when I don't like them. And that doesn't seem to be one of the three options, I guess, that Sohrab has presented here. In terms of whether, the sort of traditional Republican Party can declare victory now, I mean, obviously not, because Trump can change his mind tomorrow. I mean, there is no done row doctrine. I mean, maybe Sohrab has tried very hard to formulate a coherent policy, and I admire the effort. But frankly, the last, 10 years have just been whiplash. I mean, I don't know why we are helping Israel but not helping Ukraine. I could not explain to you what are the through lines here of Trump's economic policy, of his foreign policy, of his social policy. I cannot. And so, no, I think it would be very premature to declare victory. And I don't know, I'm kind of sad to see Sohrab sort of declaring defeat here. But I suspect, here's my prediction. I can't tell you what Trump's going to do, but I can tell you that I think Sohrab is going to formulate a new plan, a new way of moving forward for the right. I mean, he started off as a Marxist, and then went to neocon and is now restrainer. So I have no doubt that there is a new policy, a new doctrine. Even if there's no Trump doctrine, there will be a new Sohrab doctrine forthcoming. But
Yeah,
sorry,
ahead.
just the last thing is, Sohrab mentioned that the current Republican Party cannot deliver on the promise that was made to the working class, both in the 2016 and 2024 elections, essentially, or basically what Trump has been promising all along. I actually think the reason that Trump has retained popularity is that he did deliver during the first term for working class Americans. You did see a much better outcome, rising wages, especially among Black and Hispanic men again, and I think that's one of the reasons why they voted for him again. And I think right now you're seeing that coalition fall apart, not because of a war in Iran, but because of inflation and because of the tariffs. I think,
the war has pretty inflationary effects because of it.
That is part of it, but we were on this path long before Iran. The tariffs have inflated prices for Americans, and they have hit working class Americans very hard, and Trump is deep. That if there is one thing that Trump is consistent on, unfortunately, it is the tariffs, and that is killing these voters that he was able to win over in the last election.
Matt, I'd like to bring you in. Naomi referred to Sohrab's political journey. It's worth saying you've been on a journey yourself, and it's one of the things that gives your podcast such richness. You, in a previous life, were a movement conservative, and you've moved left. So maybe you could say a bit about that journey and what light it throws on this discussion. Then I want to come back to some of the things Naomi and Sohrab have said and ask you about those.
Sure. Yes, I am an ex-conservative. I was, when I was 22 years old, summer after I graduated from college, I was an intern at the Heritage Foundation. So I think I do know what principled conservatism, what that means, and I know principled conservatives. But I do think mentioning heritage is a very interesting example, right, in terms of accommodating Trump or learning to love Trump. But I have been now, I was received in the Catholic Church as an adult, and I started out as a young conservative. I'm on the left now. And I just want to say, pick up on some things from Sohrab. 2016 was such a fascinating election because you had not just Trump winning the GOP nomination, but Bernie Sanders almost knocking off Hillary Clinton. And I really thought that encapsulated this moment of profound discontent with establishment politics, as well as some of the substantive issues mentioned. Wars are forever wars, the global war on terror, and of course, right? The gutting of our kind of industrial economy over the years. I mean, I say I grew up conservative. Both of my parents are two-time Trump voters. I grew up in Altoona, and I can say one reason I was, compared to a lot of people like me, relatively bullish on Trump is that I had never seen a candidate in my lifetime show up at the Altoona Convention Center and say, "You're being ripped off." There was no doubt in my mind why Trump appealed to the kinds of people I grew up with. And so for me, it was kind of, there was this moment where both parties had an opportunity to kind of seize the mantle of economic populism, kind of, rewriting the kind of contract we had with, our citizens, our workers, our people. And Trump had a real opportunity to kind of go for that. And I think one of the things that's actually surprised me a little bit, perhaps, is the extent to which, it's still been mostly tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans under Trump. And then in this term, wars. That seems to be tax cuts and wars. That was the GOP thing. And I thought Trump had a chance to kind of change it. And that was an opportunity, again, that both parties had. There was profound discontent in the country. We saw that. And so I've actually been a little surprised as someone who used to be on the right. I'm again, a little surprised just how much kind of the old GOP has ultimately kind of persisted. And I think it's just extremely hard. A couple episodes ago, we had on Matt Duss, kind of a left foreign policy thinker, former foreign policy advisor to Bernie Sanders, and it's just like the muscle memory in Washington, D.C., in both parties, and in kind of the institutions like think tanks and lobbyists, like the muscle memory for war, and kind of just how the kind of uphill climb that people who both are economic populists and want foreign policy restraint, the uphill climb we face is profound. And I think it's even worse than I might have thought if you'd asked me this, like it's 2016 or 2017. I thought, oh, this will really shake things up and people will change. Here we are, a decade later.
That's a fascinating point. I want to ask Naomi and Sohrab. So Matt's suggestion, in fact, is that the old GOP, it's not the strange death of Republican America, but it's strange persistence. Do either of you recognize the picture we've just been given?
I think what I object to in this characterization, and maybe this is just sort of the natural tendency of everyone, you assume that when you agree, when you have certain ideas and certain beliefs, that they represent the views of the American public. But the ideas that you oppose...
I'm very aware.
But the views that you oppose are the ones that are represented by special interests and lobbies in Washington and people at rubber chicken dinners. And I would kind of push back on that for a minute and just say, it is possible that there are things that we're doing in this country and that there are policies that are adopted by the president and Congress because the American people want them to happen. And it's not all special interests and lobbying. And you can't, on the one hand, say Trump, finally took up what the people want with his tariffs and his immigration policies, and also say, but he didn't take up what the people wanted with his foreign policy because, think tanks and special interests are controlling that. You can look at opinion polls from one day to the next. I agree there are certain policies that seem more popular than others, but I do think that if we're going to give certain policies the benefit of the doubt and assume that there is broad American support for them, otherwise Trump wouldn't have gotten elected again, then I think we have to assume that there's broad support for certain other policies. And maybe those are contradictory, but I wouldn't just write them off as special interest lobbying and sort of Washington just being used to wanting to have wars.
Sohrab.
Yeah, I agree. I think, truly, for the most part, all regimes are at least a little democratic, small d democratic. Globally, even the most authoritarian states have to sort of, other than like the really truly totalitarian ones, they have to sort of work with the people, otherwise they will face mass discontent in a way that's dangerous. So my point is, I agree at least up to a point with Naomi. However, I will say this, that there are issues in which both parties take up that are deeply unpopular. They're like 80-20 issues, 30-70 issues, and their commitment to them could not be explained but for the infrastructure that Matt laid out, which is, on the Democratic side, John Judas and my friend Roy Teixeira described that as the Democratic shadow party. Like, why is it that there are issues that are like wildly unpopular that are dear to the left, but for the rest of the country, like transgender athletes in women's sports, why do they pick them up, right? Or why was it that Kamala Harris, in a famous questionnaire put out by the ACLU, she was asked, would you support public funding for transgender surgery for illegal immigrants detained by the United States? And you put all the sort of boxes that subject potentially checks off. They're trans, they're illegal, and they're detained. Would you, like, that issue was one of the ones that really, like, the Republicans could hammer in 2024, and of course she, like, was one of the things she regretted. So that was like the influence of, again, on the left they call it the shadow party or the groups, and on the right you have those. You have people who are, yes, there is like a mass movement that votes for a candidate, but the people who drive the agenda of the party might be, like defense lobbyists on the right, extractive industries on the right, so like oil and gas, and the kind of person I described, the owner of small and regional capital who is very, very anti-regulation, anti-New Deal, and wants to overthrow all that, but that's not a popular position. Like, attacking Medicaid is deeply, deeply unpopular. Attacking Medicare is deeply, deeply unpopular. Attacking Social Security, and yet the Republican Party can't help but want to, its ideologues, its writers, and some of its lawmakers can't help but go to that. So there I would say you see that where it's, yes, there is a democratic, small d democratic basis to our politics, but it can be distorted by the power of special interest groups. Maybe Matt wants to add.
I mean, and to be honest, I regret if I use the phrase special interest groups. That's not really what I mean. I mean, as you were getting at, the intellectuals, the writers, the think tanks. There's kind of this built-in infrastructure at DC whose default position is militarism, kind of aggressive foreign policy in war. And the number of realism and restraint kind of outfits, they're at a severe disadvantage. And this is just like a partisan comment. I mean, Democrat think tank, Republican think tanks. That's what I'm talking about.
I mean, in foreign policy, this is sometimes called the blob, right?
Yes, the blob. Yeah, that's what I mean. It's not like, some lobbyist, makes a specific ask to this legislator. I'm talking about when something happens, when events occur, what do you do?
I mean, I guess you just have to ask who's leading who, because, so we just talked about the Heritage Foundation, which is the largest, richest think tank, and basically the Heritage Foundation has become a group of yes men for the Trump administration. They're not advocating any kind of adventurous foreign policy, so I guess it doesn't seem to me as set in stone as maybe one might have thought 10 years ago. I mean, I think there are people in Washington who, yes, they want to be influential, but they want to be where the power is. And if Trump has moved power in a certain direction, they're happy to go along with that.
So I would slightly, as an empirical point, challenge that, which is the Heritage Foundation did put together Project 2025, and at the time, it included very much like the full suite of hawkish foreign policy agendas. Notably, the only place where it introduced debates was on tariffs, where instead of just being pro-tariff, because I read the document, they had a debate between a pro-tariff and an anti-tariff libertarian. A pro-tariff type of protectionist person and a libertarian anti-tariff. But on the other issues, it was basically the same old Republican, like, we're going to dismantle the Department of Education, lower taxes, cut regulations, war here and there. And interestingly enough, Trump disavowed the document during the campaign because he knows that a lot of the things in that thing are really, really unpopular. And I wrote an essay for the New Statesman, the British left of center magazine, in which I said, see, look how smart he is politically. He's disavowing because he knows how terrible this stuff is. And of course, in office, if I were one of the authors of, and it's like written by a committee, but if I were that committee that put together Project 2025, I'd be feeling pretty good about myself.
That's a good place to stop and invite the audience to come in. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, of which there are many. One hand has already shot up. I'll come to you, but can I just make the ritual plea that you ask a question rather than make a statement?
Please state your question in the form of a question.
Please, yes, exactly.
In an interrogative tone.
Yeah. Yes, please.
So my question is, I'm really curious about how Trump is able to use this division within like religious individuals. So like we've seen with like how the white man's burden was used religiously to like divide people in terms of races. How do you think that? Do you think that this is something that is specific to Trump? Or is it something that's just historically like repeating itself, where there's a division between like individuals for appealing to their hate for other groups, or appealing to different types of divisions within societies?
So there's a question about religion and an appeal to division. Who wants to have a stab at that? Sohrab.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Trump, at least again in the 2024 campaign, made moves that were pretty surprising. For example, he went up to Michigan, having in 2016 instituted the so-called Muslim ban, which really was a ban on immigration from 7 terror-producing countries. By the way, legitimately terror-producing countries, but you can take that as you will. But despite that, in 2024, he went and got the endorsement of important Muslim mayors and imams. So I guess I'm trying to put this in a forward-looking way, is that the most effective Trump, the best part of Trump, is when he adds to the coalition. He can be very smart, and by the way, political parties should be out to add to their coalition, wherever you can find it. So he would be like in Hasidic neighborhoods in New York, and he would get the rabbis who will blare like the pro-Trump music, in Brooklyn neighborhoods, and then also various imams who endorse him. So I mean, that's kind of what you should do in politics. I would say that more recently, I mean, it was already incipient. There's also been in parallel a movement on the right, which is, it's not even very religious. It's legitimately racist. It's gathering strength, and it's there. And they're very unhappy with Trump for not for my reasons where I'm like, why isn't he partnering with organized labor? But for very different issues. But at any rate, it's there. It's like this kind of eugenic tendency, which I think was part of shadow republicanism all through the 20th century, by the way. I mean, Matt is actually a better historian of the 20th century, right, than I am. But it was always there. But Buckley, despite some of his other instincts, sort of suppressed it and put it under some pressure. And I think that stuff I see online very resurgent, and I find it very troubling. Straight up kind of eugenic racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned the Groyper issue at the beginning. Very interesting suggestion from Sohrab there that part of Trump's political genius is as a coalition builder. But I think it's turning out that coalition is perhaps more brittle than we thought.
Sorry, just very quickly, he could have done a lot with it.
Yeah.
I really think he could have outflanked the Democrats and done like a lasting realignment that would have, for 20 years, turned the Democrats into a kind of rump party, the way the Republicans were headed to.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I mentioned 2016. The kind of Democrats had their Bernie option, Republicans went with the Trump option. But I really thought this was a moment, and even if you look historically, scholar of the presidency, Stephen Skowronek, kind of his notion of presidential regimes, these 30, 40-year periods where there's a prevailing common sense, that is almost the kind of operational public philosophy, and it's kind of heralded by a president like FDR, right? Inaugurated a certain kind of era of American politics. Reagan did so as well. But the interesting thing is Obama didn't, and it seems like Trump hasn't either, even though there was this coalition building opportunity that really did look like some kind of, well, either like Bernieism or Trumpism in some ways, in terms of what they were running on in 2016. Economically populist, critic of our foreign policy, so on and so forth. That was kind of, one reason I was so upset about the 2016 primaries. I mean, I'm on the left. It's, I have to be upset about it still. But it really was because I thought this was an opportunity where someone who kind of had a real vision could, in fact, kind of inaugurate the next era of American politics. And it would look on the left something like Bernieism, and on the right something like Trumpism, but it hasn't quite turned out that way. We still haven't kind of turned that corner. And someone who's willing to go all in building a coalition that's kind of, I think, almost waiting to be called into existence.
And this is the point you were making earlier, Naomi, as far as assertions about Trump's political philosophy. For you, there's no there.
Yeah, and again, I'm not even sure that we can attribute to him, like, he wakes up one morning and is like, I'm going to, divide people and, get this group, against this group. And, because the next morning he may decide that he's going to go campaign in a bodega in the Bronx, which, Republican candidates don't traditionally do. So I agree, that he definitely also has this instinct to go out and add to his coalition, but the next day he blows it all up. So consistency is not there.
Let's take another question. Yes, here. If you wait for the mic.
I commit to shorter answers from now on. Sorry. It's just a lot to say.
I wanted to ask about the rise of conservatism in young men. We saw in the 2024 elections how they voted for Trump in major waves. Do you think that Trump has a major influence on this group, or do you think it has more to do with like internet conservatives like Nick Fuentes and previously Charlie Kirk?
So it's a good question about Trump's appeal to young men. Who wants to take that, Naomi?
I mean, there's definitely a huge gender divide, among Trump supporters. I think that, the internet has fed that, and Trump has, fed the internet aspect of it. There's probably some chicken and egg aspect to it. But yeah, I mean, I think, Trump is still very popular among young, and not just conservative men, just among young men generally, among young independents. There is something about the machismo, there's something about his persona that they like, I don't know, where it's going. I mean, we haven't really talked about what, the Republican Party or conservatism looks like post-Trump, and whether there's somebody who's gonna fill those shoes next.
I posed that very question to Abdul El Sayed, who is a Michigan progressive running for he's trying to unseat the kind of conventional establishment Democrat. And I said, because he's trying to become one of the Democratic Party's young men whisperers, meaning like to try to sort of overcome this gender divide that's happened. And he said many things, and I recommend the interview. I think the headline we gave it is like the Democratic Party's young man whisperer or something like that, but you can find it. But he said, among other things, that I don't know anyone under the age of 30 a young man under the age of 30 who doesn't have a problematic relationship with one of the following: video games, porn, weed, or online gambling. And he got for that comment, he got a lot of backlash from some much further to his left who are very libertarian on these issues. But he was getting at, he's like, there's this sort of despair built into these forms of entertainment that can become all-consuming, and the Democrats should have an answer for it. And that might mean, for example, he listed that, when he drives down in Michigan, his daughter, who's young, asks him, like, what is that ad saying? And it's a weed ad, and he doesn't want to explain to her what it is. And he's like, and so that's kind of his theory of, that these young men want a society that is more orderly in some ways and can address these dysfunctions that they have. And they don't feel like the left addresses that. They rather feel that the left only demonizes them as toxic and blah, 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 blah. And so, like, that's a guy who's, I think, in an interesting way, is trying to address the divide from the left in search of policy solutions that I, as someone on the right, would also often sign up to.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I didn't realize you'd talked to the Michigan Senator candidate. That's really interesting that his young men have a problematic relationship to one of those four things. That's super interesting. And I would just add, because I do struggle to understand like the precise influence of someone like Nick Fuentes. It's bad, obviously, whatever influence he has, but kind of, what's kind of like the scale of his influence? Who is he mostly influencing? Meaning, is it other like online right-wing edgelords? Is it normies out there? Like, I just don't, that's not kind of my area of expertise. But I will say the other thing about young men is that I feel like some of us on the left have trouble admitting is there is a kind of constant drone of mediocre white man, mediocre white man, mediocre white man, like, and it's, I think
you mean
that,
like in movies and advertising?
just like the discourse,
Yeah.
right? Like kind of that phrase, and I think there's a weird way in which, like, it might not, I'm not talking about, Joe Biden didn't talk like this. Kamala Harris didn't even talk like this. I mean, almost like the ambient, progressive, like, atmosphere. It's kind of like, yeah, you're a young guy, you're probably a little problematic. And I think that is seeping into the consciousness. It leads to, I mean, I'm not justifying it, but I do think, like, you kind of absorb that message again and again and again. It starts to shape your partisan and political allegiances and preferences. It has to. How could it not?
It's probably a conversation for another occasion about the difficulty the left has in broaching precisely these sorts of cultural questions. There are many hands. I think there was one there, and then we'll come to you.
Like three, and then
Yeah, can we do three together? If you just put them very quickly, there, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
Okay. Wait, do I go first? Okay.
Yeah.
This question specifically for Matthew. For one, I love the honesty and like how upfront you are about like the switch you had. But I want to know, where did that switch come from? Like, what led you to realize that that's not where you wanted to be anymore? And in terms of that, I mean, like, you said you were right, very right, and now you're far to the left. And I want to know what caused that switch for you.
Let's let Matt tell his own story, and then we'll do the other questions.
I'll just say there's a lot I could describe in that realm. Obviously, I wrote a piece about it for Dissent in the summer of 2016 called Leaving Conservatism Behind. But I'll answer very briefly by saying what I wanted to just call that essay was late to class, which is to say a kind of belated class consciousness and a kind of rejection of, if I can put it this way, the kind of like upward mobility, bootstrap narrative. Because I was like an example of that. And then that worked until it didn't. And it kind of taught me something about human limits, about the circumstances we find ourselves in and how they shape us. It's not a counsel for despair, but it was like a fundamental rethinking, especially economically, of how I understood our individual lives and the world.
So let's group three questions together. One here, one there, and then one there. Right here.
Hello, thanks for speaking with us. So the title of this talk, right, was How Principled Conservatives Came to Love Trump, which doesn't seem to be exactly what happened here. But my question is about the broader evolution of the Conservative Party and how the behavior, rhetoric, and policies of Trump have seemed to shift the party, not in a way that some are tolerating it, but others do seem to have developed this appreciation for it. And I was wondering about your thoughts about how that's going to impact the party as in the future.
Great. And we can come here at the front.
So my question is kind of piggybacking off of the previous question about, not specifically about young men appealing or being appealed to by Trump. It's more so just about, I guess, since you guys addressed Trump's character and how that has seemed to garner in a lot of support and attention from people part of the MAGA coalition. I'm curious to know, given Trump's criminal history, 34 convictions, and his involvement in the Epstein files, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the supporters of Trump that denounce pedophiles, rapists, and criminals, and yet support a politician, a president like Trump?
Thank you. And there's one here. I think we'll just take, if you can make it very quick. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. I was 11 in 2016, so my political awareness, like many of us here, probably isn't, the best. I just wanted to ask, the conservatives on the panel, what really are you disillusioned with by Trumpism? What isn't doing it for you that conservatism is doing for you? Because all I know is the qualities mass deportation, limits on abortion, stuff like that I feel like is coming to fruition. So I just want to know, what are you dissatisfied with? I also want to say I really like Know Your Enemy. It's right up there with In Bed with the Right for me. So thank you. That's it.
Thank you.
So I think 3 related questions. The first one was about what do you make of the shift of the GOP under Trump? Is it permanent? There was a question about young men, Trump, but also about Trump's character and how conservatives who tend to trumpet the notion of virtue can make their peace with a president who's received so many criminal convictions and seems to be implicated in the Epstein files. And then the final question, which I suspect really is one for you, Sohrab. Why are you so disillusioned?
Well, I think it's sort of for Naomi too, insofar as she keeps balls and strikes, or attempts to. But I'll do sort of the first and third question in rapid order. So the first one is, I think Trump is both a creator of the kind of changes that you described, the more vulgar style of communication, the immediacy, the crazy AI videos that now the Department of War puts out. He's both a creator of that, but also a symptom of the media changes that have taken place concurrently with him. And it's hard to say which of these he's caused and which he's the effect of. But I think a lot of Americans could tolerate his kind of gruff rhetoric and the sort of insult comic style that he had when it was when he was pointing out the kind of bloviating failed establishment, and he was puncturing a bloviating failed establishment's illusions about itself. He's like, you've all look at the world that you've brought about. It's terrible, and I'm going to dump on you in the most vulgar way. And I think that has a kind of tribune of the public kind of energy about it that was successful. When he becomes, as I see it, and this answers the third question, when he's basically morphed into a continuation of the George W. Bush era, for example, with the war, which is one of my deepest sources of disappointment. He was, for a lot of people on the right who had sort of undergone this evolution from 2016 to 2024, the reason you elected Trump was to forestall what just happened in the Persian Gulf. And suddenly and this answers the first question and the third one, when you're in this terribly serious situation where all these U.S. allies are literally on fire from Iranian rockets, their entire base architecture has been destroyed or severely damaged, the Fifth Fleet is no longer there, all these things that I thought were good but played a role. And oil prices are approaching, well north of $100, and people say maybe $200. When it's that serious, and the media output of the White House is edgelord videos, suddenly it becomes much worse. You're like, oh my God, no, Or when a reporter asked him last night a question over the weekend he really had a crash out, is the new term apparently, where a reporter asked him on the plane, why are we moving 5,000 troops, including 2,500 Marine Expeditionary troops? And he said, that's one notch toward your treason charge. You know, like it's such a crazy thing to say. And again, the stakes are suddenly very high. Even if you support the war, you should want a serious mind at the end. That's why some people like Robert Kagan and others who are hawks are like, or John Bolton are like, oh, no. Because suddenly in this most very serious moment, he's like being a clown and it's not funny anymore.
Naomi, how has the Republican Party changed under Trump? I think that was
So I would just say, for me, the point is it was never funny. Like, I didn't, when Trump was on the campaign trail in 2016 and insulting Gold Star families, I did not like that, and I did not approve of his character then, and I don't approve of his now. So I didn't have this sudden realization that, you know, this was going to be a problem when we're trying to conduct serious foreign policy, that he's insulting reporters and all these other, I mean.
But
so,
a lot of Americans could overlook it.
I understand. I'm just, but in terms of the, if I'm going to take I'm a principled conservative on this panel, this was a big problem for me all along. In terms of how it's going to affect the future of the Republican Party, I am not a prognosticator, and I think we are way too far out from the. I mean, I don't think the midterms are going to go well for Republicans. I don't think I'm going too far on a limb to say that. But in terms of the next presidential election, I don't know who's going to be on top, and I marvel at kind of Marco Rubio's transformation. I mean, you were only 11 in 2016, but the way he was humiliated and embarrassed on that stage, I think people thought he was going to, you know, just crawl into a corner and go away. And to see him, you know, now these memes of him having every job on earth and having the approval of Trump, and it's something like, again, that's probably why I should not be in the political prognostication business, because I never could have seen that coming, that he would actually be, you know, one of the possible contenders for a leader of the Republican Party would never occur to me. I just do want to make one last point here, because I think I've kind of let it go a few times. The notion of sort of conservatism and even free market conservatism as only concerned about kind of maximizing individual autonomy is not the conservatism that I subscribe to. I do believe that there are, and this is why there are in my view, there are sort of three important legs to this school. I think that the social conservatism is an important part of that, and that the idea that people do, that we do in America care about, you know, sort of the community, not just maximizing individual income, I think is a kind of slur that is thrown against conservatives, and it should not be. So the question of you know, how we go forward, I don't, just because I want, you know, fewer tariffs and more immigration, does not mean that I don't care about individuals. I think if you look around the country and you think about some of the most important things that conservatives care about right now, they care a lot about school choice. And one of the reasons that they care about school choice is not just that they looked at you know, what was going on Zoom during COVID and they saw how badly their kids were doing in school. It's also that they looked at some awful schools that were trying to serve like the most vulnerable communities, and they said, these are terrible and this system is not working. And they supported charter schools, and they supported school vouchers, and they supported Catholic schools. And I think that, you know, understand, just because you may not like those policies doesn't mean that there is not at bottom a reason that conservatives are supporting them, that is not just about the bottom line or individual autonomy. It is about caring for those vulnerable communities. So I'll let that go.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. I'm very sorry about that. I suspect this is a conversation that could have gone on all night. I'm sure it will in various other settings. I want to thank you for your questions and ask you to join me in thanking Matt, Sohrab, and Naomi. Thank you.